From HanselMinutes.com, it's Hansel Minutes, a weekly discussion with web developer and technologist Scott Hanselman. This is Lawrence Ryan announcing show number 557. In this episode, Scott talks with Una Kravets about rethinking front-end design and development.
Hi, this is Scott Hanselman. This is another episode of Hansel Minutes. Today I'm talking with Una Kravets, who is a UI engineer at DigitalOcean. How are you?
I'm doing great. How are you doing?
I am very happy to have you on the show. I am constantly going down your Twitter and just starring all the cool stuff that you build, and then also feeling bad about my own GitHub contributions because yours is so green.
Do not feel bad. There are so many ways to contribute to the development community, not just on GitHub.
Yeah, so I should not feel bad about my not so green GitHub graph.
Yes, never let that make you feel bad. Those are just some weird visual ways to kind of guilt us into contributing more. So Don't worry about it.
I was thinking I would just start making like spell check people's sites and then just do a pull request a day with like spell check, and then maybe it would look like maybe people would hire me then.
I think that you're fine to get hired.
You think I'm okay? So you put out something really fun a couple of weeks ago that I just thought was so great. I wanted to talk to you about it. And it's a website that people can go check out right now. You might not need JS.com. You might not need JavaScript. Where did you steal this from?
So I stole this from a website called You Might Not Need jQuery.com, which is not new at all. That came out a couple of years ago. Mm-hmm. I don't remember exactly when, but I remember I was just learning development when that site was out. And it was a really good resource for me to sort of realize that jQuery wasn't necessary. And there were a lot of ways to do things in vanilla JavaScript instead of turning to a framework instantly. Yeah, that site is actually still super interesting. You might not need jQuery.com, but it has like examples of here's how to do something in jQuery and here's IE8 plus. So it is a little dated, but it is a really interesting perspective. Well, I think the idea there was that jQuery solved a lot of problems with browsers, specifically mending the gap between possibilities and support on browsers. So that's the big reason why people use jQuery. And then if you're going to replace that with vanilla JavaScript, they wanted to provide a way that you can ensure that the browsers you're supporting as a company are available to you, like the methods to do that on the browser that you need is there.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'm sure that neither of us wants to disrespect or pick on jQuery at all, but it does kind of feel a little bit like it made JavaScript so easy and it made doing stuff so easy that people just used it for literally everything.
I think we're seeing a lot of that today. And it's not that there's a problem with jQuery. I think jQuery was a great solution. It is a great solution for a lot of challenges that we have on the web today, and that's why it was created. But I think the whole idea of using a framework without thinking much if you need it or not, and then the whole idea of how dependencies just grow and grow from that individual framework is a problem. So the whole point of writing this You Might Not Need JS like little parody was to sort of showcase CSS and just to make a commentary that we don't need to always be turning immediately to JavaScript solutions for a lot of web components that can be native or can be done with a mix of HTML and CSS.
Mm-hmm. One of the most canonical examples that I think of as far as like how JavaScript is hurting us all is let's say I want to put together a quick site. I don't really want to do all the CSS myself, so I go to like ThemeForest or something and I find some great theme and I look at it and it looks and behaves the way I want. It visually is like awesome. And I pay for it and I download it and I open it up and I go, oh no, what have I done? Because in order to achieve that gorgeous look that I wanted, for whatever reason, they've done 15 different custom JavaScript things and custom bootstrap this, and I did not realize the weight of what was beneath it to do something as simple as a hero image that goes and, shows me an image slider.
It's not just cognitive weight there. It's like physical load on your user as well.
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah, that's a double-edged sword there. And it's harder to sort of style things if they're styled in JavaScript and you weren't expecting that when you originally bought the theme. Yeah, I think JavaScript, because it's so powerful, people find versatile ways to use it, which is great. But overuse, I think, is a problem that we're seeing, and it has potential to just make development more difficult for more people.
Do you think it's because people think JavaScript equals interactivity, and if something moved on the page, or if something did something when I clicked on it, it must have been JavaScript, so then I must use JavaScript?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good way to put it. I think that that's still true in a lot of ways. You can't really do a toggle with CSS. I wish there was like a toggle pseudo selector. That'd be awesome. But you still do, you probably need JavaScript, like in projects in total, overall. Let's just say that. And also JavaScript allows for a lot of important add-ons to websites. Like accessibility is not something that's inherent in browsers, unfortunately. And you can make a website and try to create an experience as much as you can. But if you're introducing components that aren't native to the structure of just like a plain page, if you have some interactivity in there, you probably need to also include accessibility considerations through JavaScript. So that's like the biggest place where something like You Might Not Need JS sort of falls, because a lot of these examples, while they may be cool to look at, if you're trying to make your site fully accessible for every user, that includes users who use screen readers, users who need the keyboard to navigate, it's a high possibility that you're going to need to use some sort of JavaScript to support those users.
Yeah, so we definitely agree that very, very often, if not always, JavaScript is going to be needed. But like, let's look at that example you said, like you wish you could have a toggle. On your site, you might not need JS.com. You've got a cool modal kind of dialogue thing, which is not quite a toggle, but you click on a button and then it pops up a modal, and then you have like a little X and then it closes it. That's a little bit of interactivity. That's pretty impressive. And it's done in like 4 lines of CSS.
Yeah, there are a lot of creative solutions. And I strongly think that the more people we have thinking about ways to write interactions without JavaScript, the more patterns that we'll have. But right now, people just turn to JavaScript immediately, turn to the patterns that they know, and are even using patterns that are included in frameworks to sort of build things out. So if I'm building a website and I wanted to use a JavaScript framework like React or Ember, there's likely already examples and solutions out there of patterns like the modal that are very intertwined with the system that I've already integrated. So that makes sense. But then if I don't have that system and I'm using these as examples, maybe somebody that's new to this web world just expects all of these interactions, every single one, to require JavaScript, which isn't necessarily true. I think a good example is forms. Like there's a lot within native HTML, form validation, and like uploading files and like just picking colors. These are all things that are native to browsers and we don't need additional plugins for. When I first started web development, that wasn't true. You needed to include a separate form validation checker, to make sure that things were working properly. But as browsers evolve, these things are all just becoming more inherent to the web. So, I think that is really important for people to realize that there are solutions that they should look into before including another dependency and adding weight that you're sending to your users.
That's a good point. So then if I look at the site, and you call it a parody, but I think you should give yourself some credit for it. It's really food for thought is the way I looked at it. Like using form validation, there's resources like Mozilla's data form validation page, and there's examples of how to do like phone number validation without necessarily including like a regular expression in your, in JavaScript somewhere. You're not just reminding us that CSS can do stuff, but that there's HTML5 isms that some of us may have forgotten about, like pattern equals.
Right. There are a lot out there that I think people forgot about or they didn't realize existed because they just turned to JavaScript for the answer to that. So that was kind of a big part of this, just kind of making people think and rethink if they necessarily need to turn to an external plugin immediately.
As a person that watches, designers and engineers like yourself seem to just know this stuff intuitively, I feel like it's moving so fast that I've become overwhelmed. Do you go to websites like Can I Use, or do you just know that you can use something or you can't use something?
Oh, I definitely turn to Can I Use because I don't know what the latest browser technologies are. Like I'm constantly
It sure seems like you all do. You know what I mean?
Sorry?
It just seems like you all do. Like, I feel like UI engineers just seem to know this stuff. And as I watch you all on Twitter, it's just like, oh my goodness, I need to catch up.
Well, I think that not all of us, but people who keep up on this really sort of religiously, like, what's new out there? I have a great curated Twitter feed just because I follow all these people who are doing cool things. But from that, it doesn't mean that something is supported in browsers. So that's why you need to go to Can I Use and see if it supports the browsers that your company supports. Like today, I saw this really, really cool feature that's coming out. It's called color fonts, and it allows for colors like to be SVGs to become individual glyphs in icon fonts, which solves the problem that people have of not being able to use icon fonts because you only get like a single color. It solves that problem, and it also allows you to create multicolored typography on your page as a single glyph, which is super, super cool. And I think the possibilities are great for this, but it's only supported in Firefox and Edge. So you kind of have to weigh those pros and cons and see what's on the horizon, and also be more realistic about what you can use today.
Yeah, that's a tough one. And those are the kinds of things where you'll burn an entire week trying to figure that out. Something simple like, oh, look, there's the feature I need, but it only works in this browser. Then you're poking around at, websites from 2014 that tell you how to do it in pure CSS or how to do it with SVG. And then you're looking at all the 15 different ways SVGs don't work the way you thought.
Yeah, it's like that meme that's like, there are 14 standards. We need to write a new standard that consolidates all the 14 standards and just has one. And then it's like current status, there are 15 standards.
Yeah, exactly. And even when there is a standard, like I think we all love SVGs. You had a great blog post earlier this year about weird SVG consistencies. Like you can't just drop it in like a PNG and assume it's going to work.
Right. That's another thing to be aware of. Even if you do your browser Can I Use checking beforehand, there are oftentimes bugs in certain browsers that you might find or uncover by accident. So it's really important to actually test in multiple browsers before shipping. And this is something that I don't think anyone is like perfect at doing. But if you create standards in your company and create like some sort of testing suite or continuous integration system to sort of remind you to do these things or enforce them, it really helps with the consistency. And I know that I've shipped things that turn out to like be broken in Chrome on Windows or something. And that's how you learn. Like all the things that you mentioned in this blog post I wrote, it was like 3 SVG inconsistencies. Those were all things I discovered after I was shipping something. I was like, oops, let me wind that back and see why that happened.
Yeah. And one of them, like you had one that was the blocky appearance where an SVG looks fine, an icon looks fine, and then it breaks in IE or breaks in Firefox. And you spend a lot of time thinking you can fix it with CSS or fix it with HTML, or maybe it's a bug. And then you actually have to go into the SVG document itself and like modify the document, the clipping mask or whatever.
Yeah, that's exactly what that was. I had to open them all in Illustrator individually because there's no automated tool to do that, and remove the clipping mask.
One of the great examples that you did that really blew my mind on your You Might Not Need JS was a scroll indicator where you have a viewport with some stuff in it and you're scrolling and there's like a progress bar at the top. And that was done without JavaScript.
This is a really interesting one because I think it shows the power of visual CSS, but also one that I wouldn't recommend in production. There are usage notes now underneath all of these, but... Right.
This particular one says there's no screen reader support.
There's no screen reader support, but also mobile does not find this very fun. What it's essentially doing is it's creating a background gradient on your entire page to create this scroll bar, and then it's hiding it so you only see the fixed area at the top. And as you scroll, it shows different parts of that gradient, like it scrolls up, so it fills up the whole bar. So this is really like an example of creative CSS, something that is clever and like a hack, but definitely not recommended to use in a production application. And this one I found from Mike Riethmuller, and he's on the resources on the You Might Not Need JS page for the example. So yeah, props to him for that really cool CSS hack that I do not recommend you use in production.
Yeah. That one's at codepen.io, and you can see it's made by Mike. And he also says, I wanted to see if I could do this. You shouldn't, and talks about the consequences of it. But that's such an interesting one because you can see why one browser might not like that, because you just said it makes a background gradient on the entire site. So somewhere it's calculating this massive gradient and then hiding it.
Yeah. So it works. It seems to work fine on desktop. But again, if your website is going to be on the internet, I don't recommend you just look at your own system and say, oh, it works on my system. So
this episode of Hansel Minutes is brought to you by Braintree Payments. Why make payment integration more difficult than it has to be? Braintree's powerful full-stack payment platform allows you to accept nearly any type of payment from any device with one integration. It's flexible to your system's needs, supports most programming languages, so whether you're using Java, Ruby, or Python, you'll always have a range of server-side and client-side SDKs available. Braintree makes payments and your job a whole lot easier. You can learn more at braintreepayments.com/Hanselman. That's braintreepayments.com/Hanselman. So do you, is the lesson here for me to just always check, do I really need JavaScript? Like at every decision, do you do that? How do you catch yourself from filling up your pages with just unnecessary modules?
Well, for me, the golden rule is start small and then add on. So if I can build something without JavaScript, if I can build it with just HTML, with no CSS, I will build it with just HTML. If I need some kind of styling on that, then I'll add a style layer. If I then need an interaction layer, I'll then add an interaction layer. But always start from the basics and then add on. This is sort of the idea also behind progressive enhancement, where you start with a base experience and then you progressively enhance your website to include things that are additional, things that you might need as you grow this component. Same thing with a JavaScript framework. I would not recommend anyone just dive into using React. I would say try to build it in the most basic way possible first. Try to build it as a static website. If you need more interaction than that, then think about interaction. Then think about if you need another layer, if you need a framework to build it. But yeah, kind of like what I was saying earlier in the podcast, I think a lot of people just jump to frameworks because it's the new hotness and don't realize that building like a single page blog does not require a framework behind it to stand it up.
You know, that is a really good point that we should kind of like double click on, because frameworks have made it so easy. It's so easy to just go and like start with Bootstrap. And as a developer who is not a designer, I am not a unicorn. It's overwhelming to me now for some reason in 2016 to go and like open up, Notepad or Vim and say, all right, HTML, black text, white background, and build it like that. But when I see really good designers, they do just that, because they build it exactly as you said, from nothingness, so that there's no more than they need.
Yeah, it's a nice like keep it simple principle.
Do you catch yourself like not following that? Like you say that, but are you going to like hang up on the podcast and then go and bust out a framework? Or is this really the right way for us to do it?
Well, that's a good question. I think a lot of it depends on what the product is. So the only time that I've actually used React has been when I was like making a side project just to learn how to use it. I've never found myself needing it for any application that I've worked on. All of my personal projects, for the most part, can work as static sites with some JavaScript that I write like natively for it. And then at work at DigitalOcean, we use Ember. So our application does require some sort of framework because it's this interactive application that needs to speak to like middleware and the server, and it's a much larger thing than just a side project or a blog website. And there are a lot of reasons that we're using a framework in terms of sort of uniformity among the team. Those decisions are already made for us, kind of why we chose Ember. It's that there are these larger components that require something that is more, I don't want to say heavy-handed, but a more heavy-handed approach to a production web application than a lot of people who are just building like smaller projects.
Yeah, definitely. So if you're building something like DigitalOcean, there is a certain expectation that this be tight and clean and sharp and performant, while a one-off goofy website that we might make, or even my blog, is somehow less important. But like I'm looking at your source right now for una.im, and it's really kind of classic HTML. It's very clean. I do have one question though. You have a section called critical CSS where you have inline CSS, and I've not seen that before. I'm not sure. What does that do?
So what it's doing is it is downloading the CSS that you see as you instantly load the page before it loads the CSS file. So it increases performance of the website. It allows for it to visually load before the server has to send a request to download the CSS file for the rest of the styling on the page.
Ah, okay. So it is literally what it says. It is the critical
Right.
CSS, and that avoids that initial splash of unstyled content.
Yeah, exactly. And I think this is interesting because when I started web development, there was like a big, don't put style directly on your page. But there was a big push a couple of years ago in the performance community to include critical CSS. And there's a lot of tools that can help you with this. One is called Penthouse. There's a few bookmarklets that you can use to determine what the critical CSS of your page is. And then you can include it on your page to sort of reduce requests before page load.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there was an article in Smashing Magazine about the idea of critical CSS. That's really smart. Do you spend as much time like I'm sitting here like doing view source on all your stuff, making sure that I understand it? Do you do the same when you see cool things?
When I'm trying to understand something, I definitely will view source. That's absolutely a way that I learned to code. There was a website recently at a conference I spoke at called MixinConf, and it's beautiful. So I think that they took it off now, but there was an area where they had these beautiful animated SVGs that changed color at a certain point in the page. And I spent probably 30 minutes just investigating this. How did they do that? So I thought it was really cool.
That's cool. And actually at that conf, that was the one in Perth, Australia, you did a talk called The Joy of Optimizing. Mm-hmm. What were you optimizing? It
was all about images. So the whole point of the talk was modeled after Bob Ross's The Joy of Painting. And it was about making happy little pixels, like the littler, the better. So the whole talk was basically about all these different techniques for optimizing assets like media, videos, images on your sites. How that is really the biggest bottleneck in terms of web performance, and also talked about some new file formats for images that are coming out that people should be aware of. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. You talked about how the average web page size is as much as like 2 or 3 megs.
Yes, it is huge these days. And of that, 64% is images. And that 64% number has been consistent for a while, even as the average website grows with every run of the HTTP archive, which is like a bi-monthly test that is run on like the average size of web pages today. So images are growing just as fast as websites.
It seems like there are some amazing, new media companies and new websites and new blogs that come out, and I'll go to them and they look like The Verge, or they're really pretty or whatever, and then I'll do a view source and I'll go, okay, that's kind of cool. But then I hit F12 and I hit refresh, and then I do the chart, the bar chart thing, and I go, oh my gosh, that's a 4 meg PNG of a person,
Yeah, people don't realize that they can make huge, huge impact by just thinking about reducing image size.
Yeah. And they might then go, I'll make it a JPEG. But then it's like a 2 meg JPEG that's 2000 by 2000, but then they resize it rather than, tidying. How important is that, having an image be the size that it shows up on the page?
I think it's really important. So one reason that you might see larger images is because of this idea of retina screens. So sometimes people will save images at 2 times their size and then shrink them down because retina screens can show more pixels in a smaller space. But part of my talk was sort of denouncing this because you really can't tell that much of a difference on retina screens. And also you're sending such a big file to your users, and you're likely not using something like the picture element, which allows you to send multiple sources to your users when they're on smaller devices or on mobile devices. So you send this huge retina image to a giant monitor as well as a small mobile device. And that's why the web is so slow to load. Especially when you're just trying to send content to your user. Like they want to read the article. They can download a lower res version of your image and then scale up from there. Or just, send them the correct image size in the first place, and you'll save a lot of size and memory for your user.
Do all browsers do that now? Like, for example, I'm looking at MixInConf's website, and there's a picture of you and your talk and when your talk is, and it's a reasonably sized image. It's maybe 500 wide or something like that. And then I went and looked off at it, and it's actually like 2,000 wide. So that would explain what you just said about Retina displays, but the browser would need to support that. It would need to know it's on a Retina display and do that little dance where it's like, I'll show it at 100%, but I know I'm on a Retina, so I'll show it in super high res.
Right. And honestly, I would really stress that designers take a look at the differences as well, because oftentimes you will not see a big change. And you can look at those differences and then compare them to the file size savings that you're getting to make the final decision when you're sending your images and your assets.
What do you think about how Medium does that progressive image loading where it's like, oh, it's blurry, and oh, it's not blurry?
I love that. It's great. So that was sort of another example that I gave, how if I had an image that I wanted to send, I could resize that to being really small, say, from 1,000 pixels to like 30 pixels. And that image can go from being like 500 kilobytes to less than 1 kilobyte. What you can then do is stretch that image to fit the container and then apply some kind of blur to it. So you can do this with SVG, you can do this with CSS, you can do this with Canvas, and then have that be the image that your user sees. So it loads instantly, and there's still a color sort of placement of what the image makeout will be. And then the user can start reading the article while your image fades in. They're not waiting for your image to load, and then it'll like resize the page, because when that image pops in, it sometimes changes sizes if people aren't cognizant of that. So I really love that technique, and it definitely saves in perceived performance, and lets the user start to absorb that content instantly.
So these thumbnails, these JPEG thumbnails that might be very low quality, like 10 or 20%, they're like nothing. They're like a K or two, right?
Yeah, they're often less than a K. It depends on what size. So like the example I gave was half of a kilobyte. It was 30 pixels wide at like 10% quality, and then scaled up, it's just like a blurry background. And it worked really well. So I would recommend that, and then lazy load the images in, load them on top, or replace that image, and you have a much more efficient approach to displaying image loading.
Right. And then maybe make sure that those images are on a different DNS, like images.una.im, so that you get that DNS parallelization as well.
Yeah.
Interesting. So what you said, alternate image formats. What's coming?
So there are a few things that you can use right now, which I think are really great. There's a format called the webp, and webp is currently implemented in Safari and Chrome, I believe. No, Opera and Chrome, not Firefox and Safari. Okay. WebP sort of stems from WebM, which is a movie format, and it takes sort of the same idea of encoding the differences between pixels instead of rewriting every pixel like a JPEG does. So it ends up being smaller. You get like 10 to 30% savings for like identical size and quality of a JPEG to a WebP. And it also allows for alpha transparency, so you can replace PNGs with WebP. You can use this today and then use something like the picture element to replace it, or you can do server-side detection of your browser and then send assets for your user. So that could be swapping out WebP for a JPEG or PNG. Like YouTube uses these. There's a lot of sites that are starting to implement WebP because it does save that like 10 to 30%, which could be a lot if you have a lot of images on your site. So I definitely say look into WebP. There's two other formats that I think are pretty cool that are coming out. They're open source formats. One's called the BPG and one's called the FLIF or the FLIF. Both are smaller than like WebP or any of the other formats that we use today. I think FLIF also sounds funny.
No, but it's cool. I mean, it sounds silly, but like on the real, you're not going to be able to replace something like GIF with something called WebP. That's just stupid. But if you call it FLIF, like I could totally see that happening.
Well, fun fact about GIF, if you're using a GIF and it's not animated, you should probably be using a 8-bit PNG because the compression on the PNG is better. So with a similar quality item, you're probably going to have a smaller size.
Interesting. That's a good reminder. And then for old school people who are thinking about, well, I just use, the IMG tag. Could you expand a little bit more on the picture and what is the relationship between the picture element and IMG?
Yeah, so the picture element allows for somebody to send multiple sources, similar to the video element, which allows a user to send multiple sources. The browser support is pretty widely supported. See, this is another example. Like, I don't know off the top of my head what the support is, so I have to look it up. But you could send different source sets based on the screen size that your user might be accessing. And then you send an image as sort of your last input so that if the browser does not support the picture element, they can still get the image fallback.
Ah, okay. So this is part of that classic HTML trick where if I don't know what the element is, I'll just ignore it.
Yes. And with picture, you can either query size, and you can also send multiple sources. So you can send like a WebP before like a PNG, and it'll load the WebP if and only if the browser supports it.
Okay, so I say picture, I have my alternate sources, I have my WebP, I have my image, and then if I don't understand any of those, only image will be seen and the rest is just ignored.
Yep.
So then these are techniques and formats that have been around for a while. How long do we have to wait? Years, 2 years, 3 years? Or are you saying that we could be doing this absolutely right now? We don't have to wait because of these techniques?
You do not have to wait for picture element because I'm looking up the support right now. It's supported in Edge, Firefox, Chrome, Opera, and not supported in IE or the current version of Safari, but it's supposed to be supported in the next version of Safari. So that means that you could still use it and then send that fallback image with it.
Safari is kind of the new IE anyway. I'm not really feeling
I guess they're in the same boat here.
Yeah, they really are. So, okay, cool. So people can go to una.im, that's una.im, and you've got your some videos, some links to where you speak. What do you have coming up? Are you done for the year at this point?
I am proud to say that I am not speaking at a conference until March 2017. Yay!
Wow. That's really cool. Congratulations. I should do the same. It's overwhelming because you really do have to spend time building stuff and not just talking about stuff.
Yeah, and I've got a sort of big project coming down the pipeline that I'm excited to take some time to settle down and work on. I'm also moving cities next week, so that's a big change. Life stuff.
Very cool. Congratulations. Life stuff matters. Well, thanks so much for chatting with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. This is definitely a pleasure.
This has been another episode of Hansel Minutes, and we'll see you again next week.